The Elgato Facecam Pro is the first webcam that can record at up to 4K 60 frames per second. All the other webcams on the market before this, they capped out at 4K 30, if they could even do that. And this also has the largest sensor size to date. Well, it's tied with the largest sensor with the also newly released Nexigo Iris, which I will be doing several comparisons of. Have it right here. Anyway, the Facecam Pro sensor size is 1/1.8 inches. That's not the actual dimensions of the sensor, but camera manufacturers have always used a very strange method of labeling sensor size. Regardless, this is much larger than previous sensors on webcams. Most webcams are about 1/4 of an inch. In fact, I actually ripped open a Logitech C920 webcam in a previous video just to see how small it was for myself. And the original Facecam, which I'll also be showing footage of, that has a sensor size of 1/2.5 inches. So 1/1.8 with the Facecam Pro is a great improvement. Don't be fooled though, this is still really small. My Sony ZV-1, which I'll switch to right now, this has a full 1-inch sensor, which is also tiny compared to an APS-C sensor that you get on like the Canon M50 Mark II. Even a lot of older cameras like the old Canon Rebel T3, that has an APS-C sensor, much bigger than the sensor on the Sony ZV-1. And of course, neither of those are close to the size of a full frame sensor camera, like the Sony A7S III. Anyway, a larger sensor should result in several improvements. Better dynamic range, which is how much detail you can see in the dark colors and how much you can see in the brighter colors without it getting washed out and without the dark colors being crushed all the way down to black. And the larger a sensor is, the wider the field of view is by default, which means that you don't have to use a super wide angle lens with a really short focal length in order to get a usable frame. This right here is a 90-degree field of view from the Facecam Pro. Now, the last part about not having to use short focal length lenses, that's why it's easier on larger sensor cameras to get bokeh or a blurry background, where you, the subject, is in focus and then the background is not. But if I have not already spoiled things, the optics on the Facecam Pro definitely cannot produce a blurry background or bokeh. You can read all the text in the background, the Odyssey pen rows. You can see even some of the small text in the back. You can see everything just as in focus as I am. So yeah, there's still no blurry background on webcams in 2022. Switching to the Sony ZV-1, I'll talk a little bit later about why exactly that is. But if that's what you're looking for in this webcam, you can either skip this entirely, or if you're okay with a fake blurry background and you have an RTX graphics card, then you can use NVIDIA Broadcast, which actually has some features built right into Elgato's camera hub. By the way, that thing is pretty laggy. It's crashed and frozen several times. It's actually frozen right now, so. Now I switched over to 1080p 60 frames per second so that I could demonstrate this. This webcam can record uncompressed at up to 1080 60 frames per second. It's NV12. And I'll explain the benefits of that a little bit later, but that's what this looks like at 1080 60, but at 4K, the footage is compressed to MJPEG and you can see an obvious difference in the colors. There's also H.264, but that's super laggy, so there's not really too much point in using that. Now the lens's full frame equivalent focal length is 21 millimeters. What's the real focal length? Well, beats me. Elgato refuses to list the actual focal length of the Facecam Pro's lens or the original Facecam. They only will give you the full frame equivalent. But don't worry, I've been learning quite a bit more about camera optics, so I'm gonna dive into that a little bit later in this review. And lastly, the aperture of the lens is f2. And it does have autofocus, unlike the original Facecam, which was fixed focus. And here's a demonstration of the autofocus. I do think that it hunts a little bit too much and it's slow. I guess it's the drive speed. It's really not that fast, but it makes it so that it's not like super jarring, but you are out of focus for a little bit too long a lot of the times. And if you're like moving around a lot, then it can lose you, but it's not too bad, especially because I think the biggest competitor to this device, the Nexigo Iris, actually does not have autofocus at all. This is fixed focus. As far as the webcam's build and design, it has a monitor clip and 1/4 inch tripod threading, which is pretty standard. It's not quite as easy to adjust as the original Facecam, but it can still swivel left and right, tilt up and down. You just have to adjust the whole mount for vertical movement. The Facecam Pro is pretty bulky since now there's a heat sink on the back and even a reset button, probably to compensate for the fact that the last Facecam had freezing issues. They didn't fix the freezing issues with the software, but that reset button's there just in case. There's a USB-C to C wire about 71.5 inches, and there is no adapter inside, so just in case you don't have a Type-C port. And obviously you'll need USB 3.0 for this. Another thing is this does not have a microphone, which I'm totally fine with. I actually on board with. If you're gonna spend $300, that's what this launched for, on a webcam, then there is no way that you'd be using the microphone on a webcam. Otherwise, I guess do you, but you could just get a $30 standalone microphone if you're gonna spend that much money for a webcam. Lastly, there is no privacy cover on the Facecam Pro, which I think is a big L in 2022. Even the original Facecam came with the privacy cover. All the devices that I have right now, they can be closed, like, you know, obviously my camera and then the next to go Iris. It has a really bad privacy cover, but it has one, the Brio. Again, the original Facecam, the Keo Pro, like everything does. So I don't know why this doesn't. And one other thing that is just kind of interesting is you can hear the optics of the Facecam Pro moving back and forth as it's trying to get focus. Might be annoying to some, might be picked up in your microphone, but if you have a noise reduction filter, probably not. It's not really that loud. So all of the Facecam Pro's improvements are great in theory, but what does it actually look like when compared to some of the other top webcams on the market? Now, I'm actually going to start this off by speaking into the Sony ZV-1. This is my mirrorless camera because this will give you a really good baseline. In some of my previous videos, I've had people try to argue with me about how the colors of one webcam or another look better. And then one of the examples is they'll say, oh, the skin tones, your skin tone on this one looks better than what you say. And it's like, wait, there's no way that you can really judge the accuracy of a webcam's colors to my own skin tone unless you actually see me. And since none of you have seen me in real life, you really have no idea what are the colors. What does my skin actually look like in real life? What do all these boxes actually look like in the lighting that I have? Unless you've been here in this lighting, you really don't know. The only thing that you can really go by is the white balance. And even then, you actually don't know exactly what color that wall even is. It is an off-white. So the reason I'm starting off with the Sony ZV-1 is this is about as accurate as I've ever seen. Really look at how much is the Facecam Pro or any of these other webcams, how much are they deviating from this? Because this is about as accurate as I've ever seen. Let's jump right into detail and clarity. The Facecam Pro starts off very strong in this department. It's among the sharpest and cleanly looking webcams that's out. I would say it's about even in this department compared to the Next-to-Go Iris. I'll go ahead and switch over to that right now. Both of these webcams have quite good sharpness, detail in my face, detail in a lot of the textures I have. Now I will get into this black. You can't really see a lot of detail in the different like creases of the shirt of the black in the iris. That's more about the dynamic range, but I'll definitely get into that. But as far as my freckles, as far as textures on everything, both this, the Next-to-Go Iris, and this, the Elgato Facecam Pro, are doing an excellent job. Switch on over to the Brio. The Logitech Brio, it actually is a quite sharp webcam. The problem is it has so much grain that you're gonna get that kind of gritty pixelation kind of look anytime there's dark colors, and then like with all the little details as far as my freckles. And when you take screenshots, you're actually gonna see that a lot too. That grain just really gets in the way. It makes the image kind of gritty. And the Facecam, you can see, is pretty gritty as well. I think the Facecam Pro was a massive improvement over this thing. And this is where that bigger sensor starts to come into play already. Because the low light performance and indoor lighting performance is better, it's able to take in a little bit more light. It doesn't have to activate a noise reduction filter as aggressively. So there's less grain to begin with, and then there's less smoothing over of that grain like you're gonna get on maybe like an older webcam like that. Next-to-Go, even the Next-to-Go N970P, I will be showing a little bit of that. That has a nice noise reduction filter, but it does soften things a bit. And then the Logitech Brio just has that grain that just really holds the image back. It otherwise looks great, but that grain is not the business, especially when you look at this 4K full screen. It's problematic. And here's some footage of the Razer Keo Pro. It makes that thing look ultra soft and pretty much like a joke. Honestly, that webcam got passed up pretty hard, I will say. It does a lot of things well, but the sharpness is definitely not one of them. Color accuracy is where we start to have that record scratch moment. And in my initial test, the Keo Pro didn't look that terrible. I was really only recording it in isolation, and then when I compared it to this, the original Elgato Facecam, I was like, wow, what an improvement of the colors, because this is something that I really was like, you know what, the Facecam, I wouldn't buy it. I don't think it's good. Some people hated on me. A lot of people did, but this just does not look accurate. It does not look good. Again, like I can show you for the reference again, this is what I actually look like. This is the mirrorless camera. This is the Facecam, way too red, and it's just kind of got that green kind of going on in the background. There's not much you can do. I can't change the white balance to make it more amber because my skin will be even worse. Facecam Pro improved quite a bit as far as the color science. However, after testing in a bunch of different lighting scenarios and comparing to some of the other webcams on the market, let's go ahead and demonstrate what the issues are. So the Facecam Pro's color science really reminds me a lot of the AverMedia PW513, except you can't change the tint on this thing at all. You actually could kind of pick your poison with the PW513. This one, you can't change the tint. So the reds and the pinks, they're way too like of a harsh like magenta. So like my lips, that's a big thing for me, especially with my skin tone. It just makes it so like it stands out so much that it's like, dude, that's not me. My hands as well, my palms are like this kind of like, they're not this like bright red. You see the boxes, the HyperX boxes back there. Yeah, that's not what they look like. They're more of like a orangey, just a flat red, just, you know, not like that. Now, what I can do is I can alter the saturation, because the saturation's at 50% right now, and this is the color temperature I have of 4300. If I increase the saturation, you can see this will actually help my skin quite a bit. Get that brown, more of that orangey back in my skin, so it's not as like kind of like dead. This is 60% right here, but it kind of makes the lips even worse and the hands even more like crazy red, which is like, ugh. So I unfortunately got to keep this back down to 50%. Now let's go ahead and show a different webcam. This is the Nexo Go Iris, and the white balance of this thing, will say it has a little bit of issues with that, but the other colors I think are a lot better, especially my skin tone's got more of the orangey natural brown that I have in my skin in comparison to the Facecam Pro. In addition, my lips don't look like crazy. My hands aren't like, you know, this bright, crazy, glowy red that you get in the Facecam Pro. So I love the colors a lot more for most of the objects that are on the Iris. I just think that the white balance could use a little bit of tweaking, but then again, you can change the colors individually. You can add a little bit of red, add a little bit of blue, or subtract them individually from each other, not just a white balance slider. You actually get a lot of fine control with that. So you can adjust the colors with a lot more precision on the Nexo Go Iris, get exactly what you want. Can't do that. All you have is just one slider of color temperature on the Facecam Pro. But yeah, this exotic lip gloss look, the more you switch to the other devices, the more it really stands out. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Logitech Brio. This is the Brio right here, way more subdued. Again, skin tone, a lot better. Background, let's go ahead and see. You see the red is a lot more natural, and I have a lot of different colors in the background. A lot of the blues are actually pretty decent on the Facecam Pro, switching back to this, but it's really the reds that are having a massive issue. So again, this is the Logitech Brio. A little bit too much red, but not nearly as much as we're getting on the Facecam Pro. Now, part of the reason that the colors are so rough on the Facecam Pro is because of that compression, that MJPEG compression that you get at 4K, and in this case, 4K 60 frames per second. Because right now I've dropped down to 1080 60 NV12, and wow, lips look so much better. I got rid of that exotic lip gloss. The HyperX boxes, they're back. Oh man, my hands are natural again. Oh, this is sick. I love it. But you know, you got to take the good with the bad when it comes to the 4K 60, because you're going to have to deal with that MJPEG compression. And now when you compare the Facecam Pro to like the Brio, for example, it actually matches up pretty decently with it. It's actually, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, the Brio just looks way better. It's like, you know, I actually like the way that the Facecam Pro looks like if I'm going to go with that uncompressed footage. And I even like the white balance better compared to the Brio, which is what we have right here. So yeah, the colors of this actually look quite decent if you're going to be using NV12 1080 60 frames per second. And this is what I wish the original Facecam would look like at 1080 60. I would have been like, yeah, go buy that thing. And again, this is the Nexo Go Iris, and this is MJPEG also at 4K 30 on the Nexo Go Iris. Now, I don't want to focus too much on the 1080 60 of the Facecam Pro, because honestly, I don't think that's really why most people are buying this device. That's not the selling point. That's not why it's $300, at least on its launch price. It's for the 4K 60. But uncompressed, the colors look really good. They're better than the Keo Pro, which was previously the best colors that I thought, but it still had a problem with like the oranges and the reds just not being right. Obviously, in comparison to the reference footage, the Sony ZV-1 doesn't quite get there, but I think it does do a pretty decent job. So yeah, I'll give it a thumbs up as far as colors if you're going uncompressed 1080 60. Back to 4K 60 frames per second, things look up again for the Facecam Pro when it comes to the dynamic range. Again, the detail that you're gonna get in the blacks and in the lighter colors without them being too blown out, the lights, and without just being all black with darker colors. Now, the contrast slider doesn't really function on the Facecam Pro like it does on the Facecam and some other devices. If you change it, it just looks this really fake kind of artificial effect going on. The Brio has the same kind of issue, but the out the box dynamic range is actually pretty decent. Let's compare it to some other webcams so that you can see. The Nexo Go Iris has way too much black crush, and this is, I believe, with the contrast almost at its minimum. Let me check. Oh, this is one sick thing about the Nexo Go Iris is you can actually change the settings with the remote. You cannot do that on the Facecam Pro. So let's see, where is this? This is contrast. I have it at 55. So I can drop this. I've dropped this down to 30, and now the like brights are a little bit like kind of blown out with the light that's like reflecting off my face, and you see a little bit more detail in the blacks, but I don't know if this is really like the answer. And you know, yeah, like my skin tone is like very drained. The Facecam Pro is able to keep things relatively natural, and the dynamic range is pretty decent, so I like that. It does an even better job, the Facecam Pro, than the Logitech Brio. Switching over to this thing, the black's a little bit too dark. Just again, it's kind of similar. Also, there's a lot of grain in those darker areas, especially if you have this blown up to 4K. You're going to see that the noise is just going to be like top speed on the Brio and a lot less here. This is something that I think the Facecam, the original one, also did a great job at. You can even see my color. I think the color of my shirt is actually the best in this as far as the dynamic range goes. A lot of the other colors are like really off, but the dynamic range, I think, of the Facecam, the original, I have the contrast down to its lowest, is actually really good on this thing. Now this obviously is the best. This is the Sony ZV-1, has the largest sensor. I also have the contrast dropped to its minimum value on this, and I have the dynamic range optimizer up to level 2, just some technical stuff, so that you could see a ton of detail. Like in my shirt, you can see all the like textures going on here. This is something that, like, if I switched over to the Facecam Pro, you're not going to quite see all of those wrinkles going on there, but you are still going to see that and everything with the Sony ZV-1. But still, for a webcam, this thing is doing a pretty good job. And I think it's surprising how much better of a job it's able to do with keeping the whites from being blown out when I decrease the contrast, like on the Nexago Iris, and keeping the darks from getting black crushed like on the Iris, because they have both a 1/1.8 inch Sony Starvis CMOS sensor. So if they're using the same or extremely similar sensor, why is the dynamic range so much better on the Elgato? Might be the post-processing, maybe the lens is different. I'm not really sure what it is, but whatever they did, Elgato, great job. And I think it does do way better as far as dynamic range than any of the other webcams, but in particular, much better than the Nexago Iris. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the smoothness of the footage and basically how important is the 4K 60 frames per second. So that's what I'm recording at right now. And to be completely upfront and straightforward, I think this is a massive achievement. And it still makes this webcam worth taking a look at, even if you ultimately decide against something else. Even my main camera, I'm gonna go ahead and switch it over right now. My Sony ZV-1 can't do it. And it makes it look kind of choppy, I'll be honest. Once you switch back and forth, I have to drop this thing down to 1080-60, which I will do actually, to match how fluid the Facecam Pro is. So now this is the Sony ZV-1 at 1080p 60 frames per second, but the problem is, gotta pick and choose between that sharpness and that fluidity, because this is gonna be a lot sharper now, the Facecam Pro. So yeah, my ZV-1 can't do it. A lot of the $1,000 to $1,500 mirrorless cameras can't do 4K 60. Now there is a reason for this. The larger sensors, they're gonna have to read out all those pixels. So it's gonna take a lot of processing power. That's why a lot of devices that can do 4K 60 frames per second, you know, like phones and stuff like that, and GoPros, like, yeah, they can do 4K 60, but the sensor size is similar to the Facecam Pro. They're a lot smaller, so it's a lot easier to read out all of those pixels on the smaller sensor. But even with that said, it's still awesome to be able to get that fluidity with this much sharpness. And there's some old school people, like really old school, like older than me, that are like, oh no, nobody needs 60 frames per second. Can't you see movies? They're using 24 frames. It's so cinematic, bro. Nobody needs 60 frames per second. Like, if that's you, then like, you know, go ahead and get another webcam. That's fine. This is for people that are all about that frames per second. Like me, all about it. See, the fact of the matter is, if you go down to 30 frames per second, like I just demonstrated with the Sony ZV-1, you really have to pick and choose. So let me actually show you what I mean. All right, so these are the settings on my Sony ZV-1 right now. I have it at 1/60, and this is at 4K 30 frames per second. So here's the motion blur that we're gonna have here. So you pretty much have to pick and choose whether you want the image to just be kind of choppy. Let's say if I sped up the shutter speed to like 1/80, so that I don't have too much of that distracting motion blur, but it is a little bit too choppy. You know, I could continue to go 1/100, 1/125, you know, just whatever I wanted. And then that would cut down that motion blur. I think 1/100 looks a little bit better, but the image is going to be choppy because it's just not, I'm having half of the frames in the shot. If I double the shutter speed to the frame rate, because it's 30 frames per second right now, then the motion blur, it just doesn't look that great, in my opinion. Some people love the way it looks. They say it's realistic. Nah, not a fan of that. And still, it's just not going to look as fluid, especially when you go back and forth. Facecam Pro, you get the movement and it's super smooth. And I actually have this at 1/60 right now on the Facecam Pro. Because at 60 frames per second, you really don't have to double the shutter speed anymore to get realistic motion blur because it's already so smooth. In fact, it actually gives you a lot of flexibility. I'll show a shot in the daytime when I had it at 1/120, because when there's a lot more light going in, if you speed up that shutter speed, then you can dim the shot so it's not like blown out, but you still have a lot of flexibility to do that when you're all the way up to 60 frames per second. And it's not gonna look super choppy, like as you saw here, when I brought it up to 120 frames per second on this, or 120 shutter speed on this, the image got really choppy on the Sony ZV-1. Don't really have that issue with the Facecam Pro. So basically 4K 60 frames per second allows you to get no compromises with sharpness or smoothness or motion blur. You have full flexibility. Well, actually there is one compromise that is exclusive to webcams, which is because you're plugging it through USB. You can't actually send uncompressed 4K 60 frames per second footage through USB 3.0 without delay. Significant delay. And I talked about that a couple years ago in my video of the Elgato 4K 60S Plus, which is one of the biggest weaknesses of that device. There's massive delay with that thing, trying to send through 4K 60 frames per second HDR through USB, a lot of lag. They have to use that processing power to compress the footage down, and it ends up getting compressed into MJPEG. So yeah, that is the drawback, is the colors do suffer because we're going through USB and this doesn't have like HDMI on the back. So ultimately, is 4K 60 frames per second a big deal? For me, absolutely. It is massive. It's huge. Great job, Elgato. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here in terms of the image quality is the depth of field. And this part's going to get really technical. So if you're interested in learning more about camera optics, then stick around. Now, I go more in depth on this in a video where I actually tore open a Logitech C920 webcam. So I'll give you the shorter version here, but it's still going to be pretty comprehensive. There's a very large distance from the lens that remains sharp and where the objects are in focus. There are instances where this can be useful, but the look that's coveted right now, and the one that I enjoy, is that blurry background where you're in focus and then the background, no matter how cluttered, no matter how messy it is, it's smoothed over. This is what you call a shallow depth of field, where there's a very narrow space that can remain in focus as far as the distance from the lens, and everything else is going to be blurry. This has to do with the lens. It's specifically the larger the entrance pupil of the lens is, then the more of a blurry background you can get. And again, the entrance pupil is just that little hole that lets in light. So why don't all cameras, all webcams, let's go back to the Facecam Pro, why don't they all use a large entrance pupil to get a really blurry background? Well, one limitation of the type of lens that you can use is the sensor size. 1/1.8 inches is larger than what webcams have been using previously, but it's still very small. So with these small sensors, the image is gonna appear like incredibly cropped in. So if I didn't have like a super wide angle lens like the lens that's on the Elgato Facecam Pro, it would be zoomed in quite a bit and it would not be fun to look at. I have to scoot super far back. It'd be whack, right? So to compensate for this, they have to slap a lens on top of it that spreads out light. It bends light in a way that gives you a wider field of view. These wide angle lenses have very short focal lengths. The focal length is basically the amount of space inside the lens that it takes to bend the light in order to focus it on the sensor. The shorter that length, the wider the field of view. So here you can see the specs of the Nexico Iris, 1/1.8 inch Sony Starvis sensor. And then just look a little bit down where it says the lens. It is a 4.2 millimeter focal length and f2.2 aperture. And that's this right here, the Nexico Iris. Whereas the Sony ZV-1 can produce a little bit of a shallow depth of field, and it has a focal length. I can actually see it because they actually write it right on the lens itself. It's 9.4 millimeters and the aperture is 1.8, f1.8. If you want to know how shallow of a depth of field you get, how blurry your background is going to be, you want to know the size of the entrance pupil, which you can calculate by dividing that focal length by the aperture. So for the Nexico Iris, it's going to be 4.2 millimeters divided by the 2.2, and that'll give you 1.9 millimeters. And then the Sony ZV-1, that's going to be 9.4 divided by 1.8, and that's going to give you 5.22 millimeters. And that's the diameter of the entrance pupil, so you can see how big they are in comparison. Now, what's the focal length of the Elgato Facecam Pro? Again, I have no idea. Unlike almost every webcam and camera on the market, Elgato will not display what the actual focal length is. They're happy to prominently show what the full frame equivalent is, and it's 21 for the Facecam Pro and then 24 for the original Facecam, which is what we have here, and it's a lot more zoomed in. Now, since the Iris exists, it's using a similar, if not the same sensor as the Facecam Pro. And since the aperture of the Facecam Pro is 2, I'm going to assume the diameter is going to be very similar. So I'd guess maybe about like a focal length of like 4 or something like that. And that would line up with having everything in focus, almost everything, because this actually does have a little bit of autofocus. Most webcams these days, like the Razer Kiyo Pro, they have like in between like 3.5 to 3.8. The Kiyo Pro is 3.8 millimeters. So that will definitely line up with all those. And none of them have blurry backgrounds. So why did I bring all this up? Why did I teach you all about the focal length of cameras and blurry backgrounds? Well, it's basically so that I can counterbalance the largest webcam sensor ever marketing that both Nexigo and Elgato have really leaned into. And a lot of content creators have really been like talking about like, oh, this is like such a major big deal. And it's like, it's good. I'm glad that they're increasing the sensor size. They should have done this a long time ago. Excellent. But if you don't know anything about cameras, then it is easy to get misled by that and think that, oh, this is just going to be radically better than everything else. You're going to get crazy blurry background. You're going to have cinematic footage. That's not what's going to happen with this thing. Because unfortunately, A, the sensors on this webcam and the Iris, they're still pretty tiny. B, without a lens with a large interest people to actually let in a lot more light, you don't get the extra benefits that a lens like that can get you, like a blurry background. And of course, the more light that you're able to bring in, then the better dynamic range that you can get. So if you want even better dynamic range, and more importantly, if you actually want a webcam that's going to get you a blurry background, you'll probably never see that until we have like giant sensors or sensors that are at least like 1 inch and coupled with lenses that actually have longer focal lengths than like 3.5 millimeters or 4 millimeters. All right, now I'd like to demonstrate the software, the camera hub. I already have an entire video of this when I talked about the original Facecam, so I'll just gloss over this a little bit. This software is quite buggy and it does freeze a lot and it crashes a lot. When it crashes, it will crash OBS. It will probably crash other stuff, but I've had this actually crash my entire computer. So be very careful with this software. Anyway, really quickly, what it's able to do, you can zoom, you can move around where that box is, but let's just get rid of that because it's ridiculous. And then, you can change the focus. I'm not really going to talk about too much like in depth how that's going. Contrast doesn't really work on this device. It works a lot better on the original Facecam. We can go up with the saturation, definitely help out the skin tone, but have problems with the reds and the magentas. Already demonstrated that. This actually is not in OBS. I wish you could like dock it in here somewhere, but I just have this as a side window, just kind of like over here. You can change the shutter speed and the ISO individually. You can do them by very like fine values. You can even, input your own. See, I have here, this is 1/60. In the daytime, when I have more light coming in through the window, I will put it at 1/120 or maybe 128. I think it goes to 128. But this will make it so much darker because, the faster the shutter speed, the less time that it's spending to bring in light. And it will look a little bit choppier, but since it is 60 frames per second, it is pretty fluid. You're going to lose a little bit of motion blur, but I think that that's perfectly fine. However you're going to do it, because again, you're at 60 frames per second, so you can't really go wrong. But I have it at 1/60 right now because I think this is a little bit too dark. If I bring it down, I don't want to move it all the way down to here. Some people say, oh no, you got to double the frame rate every time, no matter what. I already explained why I don't believe that that's the case. And this is the ISO value here. The higher you raise the ISO, the higher you're going to increase the grain. If I'm able to get this as bright as possible through just the shutter speed itself, definitely prefer to do that because you don't add additional grain. Like if I were to increase this, like this is an extreme example here. But now we're going to have a lot more grain. We're going to have a lot more noise, and it's something that you don't really want. White balance, now auto is something that you can't match. I think this is a little bit too blue. It's going to try to match it up, get a little bit of yellow in there over time, but you cannot get that exact value. This is 43. No matter what I do to get that yellow. So, oh, this is correct. This is not exactly what we had here. There's no way to match these, and this is because you can't change the tint. You can change the tint on the Iris, but the Iris tint, it goes in big chunks. I'll talk about that in a different video. The processing, you can't really do a whole lot here. They don't have the noise reduction anymore. And then again, you can save your settings up here, which is beautiful. There are some other effects that you can apply. but I don't have an RTX graphics card. I have an AMD graphics card. So, you know, it is what it is. All right, verdict time. This one's tough. This one's real tough. Should you buy the Elgato Facecam Pro? For most people, I would say no. This is a great device. I think it does a lot of things really well. The Achilles heel is definitely the colors, and also the fact that there's no blurry background that's an L for me. Here's how I break it down. If you already have a decent webcam, Nexago N970p, Logitech Brio, AverMedia PW513, if you already have a decent webcam, would I upgrade to this? No. Unless the price of the Facecam Pro goes down to like $230, maybe $250, but I'm thinking more like $230 or something like that. Unless the price goes down, there's only a very specific group of people that I would actually recommend this for. So here's the criteria. If you do not want or can't buy a traditional camera, like a mirrorless camera, let's say you don't want to deal with it because it's so bulky, or you don't want to have to worry about changing the settings or getting a remote, turning it around, whatever the case is, or they're too expensive, you don't want to use one. You don't want a real conventional mirrorless camera or DSLR. That's the first criterion. B, you don't really care about the colors, or you're fine with the colors. You've seen it, maybe you've tested it out and you're like, colors, I'm not really a stickler for colors. You don't really care about color accuracy too much. That's B. And C, you do care a lot about 4K 60 frames per second. If your priorities line up with all three of those, then yes, you will love the Facecam Pro, and this is the best webcam on the market for that. It's hard for me to say this is the best webcam on the market, period. It definitely has some give and take action going. It does very well in dynamic range, it does very well in sharpness, but when you use that 4K 60, the colors take such a huge dip that I can't just say it's like head and shoulders above everything else. Now, I know that was a lot of conditionals, it was a lot of ifs, but I don't want to be known as the guy that just tells everybody to go out and spend $300 on this thing. You're really close to getting something like this that has a blurry background, better colors, better dynamic range, a lot more flexibility, especially if you get something like this used. Canon M200, Sony ZV-1, Sony ZV-1F, that thing launched for $500. I'm not gonna tell people, oh, just go spend $300 and pass up this. You're already over halfway there. I think Elgato did a great job putting like a middle ground here for people that just want to meet in the middle. They don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Massive improvement over the original Elgato Facecam. Links to all of the devices that I talked about in this video are below.